Good Wednesday evening, everyone. I'm Carolina Weather Group host Scotty Powell here, and we're excited to have you back on this Wednesday evening, May the 27th, right at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. And we have Mr. John Scala on tonight. We're going to be kind of talking about the hurricane season as it kicks off next Monday, and going to give a preview to what some of the experts think is going to happen, and just talk about hurricanes in general. You know, the cause of them and the effects of them as they hit the eastern coast and the Gulf of Mexico. So we're excited to have John on tonight. I will say we were supposed to have Jamie Arnold, who is the chief meteorologist out at WMBF in Myrtle Beach, but he has got the strep throat, so he will not be with us tonight. We hope to get him back on probably somewhere in August as we kind of do a midpoint hurricane show, but we wish Jamie the best of luck getting better and getting rid of the strep throat. I know that's a nasty thing. I had it a couple months ago, and it's no fun at all. So we do have John on tonight, and we're excited to have him on. A couple of housekeeping things before we start the show tonight. This is a YouTube Google Hangout, so we do have a question and answer session. So if you have a question for Dr. Scala, please send it our way through that link, or you can tweet us or Facebook us. However you want to get a hold of us, send us those questions, and we'll make sure to get those added. You can also download this podcast, or tomorrow morning, once it gets through the process, you can go to your favorite app store and get that downloaded. And you can watch us on replay if you're watching maybe a couple months from now and you're wanting to know a little bit about hurricanes. We appreciate you watching as well. So with that, we're going to be a little bit short on time tonight. Dr. Scala's got to get going at the 9 o'clock hour, so I'm going to kind of skip our panelists and introductions. I'll tell you, it's been very dry here in the Carolinas and Tennessee, so we've not really had much weather to talk about. We did have a few storms last night that didn't produce much. So that's the weather world here in the Carolinas. We are looking at some more storms tomorrow and then a beautiful weekend. And so enjoy whatever rain you get. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ricky. Ricky's going to be conducting the interview, and then I got a couple questions I think some of the other panelists do as well. So Ricky, it's all yours, man.
All righty. Excuse me. All right. Thank you, Scotty. I appreciate it. So, as he mentioned, we're talking all about hurricanes tonight, and pretty appropriate. I don't know if Scotty planned it this way or if it just happened to come out the way it did, but NOAA released their hurricane outlook today, and it happens to coincide with our show as well.
I kind of knew about that, you know, just a little bit. We kind of planned it out. So.
Well, that's good. We don't usually plan quite so well.
But Dr. Scala, I think that's a great opportunity to go ahead and introduce the outlooks, and maybe you can comment a little bit about why we actually put out these outlooks and your thoughts personally on them.
Oh, sure. Let me preface that by saying that some of the work we do here in central Pennsylvania is to produce a winter weather outlook. So the difference between an outlook and a forecast is you're looking at trends, you're looking at how you expect either a temperature or precipitation trend to relate to the long-term averages. And when we talk about the tropical season, we're doing the same thing. The long-term tropical outlook is for 12 named storms, 6 of which would be hurricanes, and 2 or 3 being major hurricanes. That is a Category 3 or greater. And I think there's some utility here in at least trying to provide some idea of what the season may look like, but I think we can get too focused on the numbers and lose track of the fact that the most important thing is it only takes one storm, right? Just remember Hurricane Andrew in 1992. That was a major El Nino year or period, and it was just one major storm, and we know what happened as it creamed southern Florida. So the outlook is important. It gives us some sense of what the attributes of the atmosphere may be in terms of supporting or suppressing tropical cyclone activity, but we just have to be careful that we don't focus in on the number too much.
I think that's an important designation you made, calling it an outlook instead of a forecast, because it seems like most of the news stories always call it a hurricane season forecast, and I honestly had never even thought of it until today when someone mentioned it to me. What should we call it, I should say?
Well, I think the outlook is the right term. When we talk about the winter weather, we're trying to assess snowfall totals relative to the 10 or 30-year average. And I mention that because the 10-year average is different than the 30-year average. As we see changes in climate, in fact, I work closely with insurance providers, and I mention to them, if your risk is based on a 30-year average, whatever the risk may be, you really need to upgrade that to a 10-year because things are changing. And I think the same thing is with respect to what we're looking at in the larger scale atmosphere. 10 years may be a better average than a 30-year, or at least you might want to consider that.
And you mentioned insurance companies. How much trust do they put into these forecasts, or how much do they maybe change the way they do things, maybe premiums or anything that change because of that?
Oh, I think they do. They're trying to perhaps pre-position resources. If they are interpreting that outlook as being a greater probability of an East Coast landfall, then they may think ahead of time, we may need to get more adjusters, say to the Carolinas or to the Atlantic coast of Florida, versus maybe pre-positioning along the Gulf Coast. I think that's an important thing to consider. This far in advance, they're probably not doing too much, but it's always in the back of their mind.
And how about from a different standpoint? I mean, I've worked a little bit with emergency managers, but have you communicated with some of them in the past and seen how they kind of work with these things?
I was actually, a couple years ago, I gave a talk to a group of insurance professionals, and I think there were some emergency managers there as well. This was in Florida. And I was talking about what different aspects of the atmosphere play a role in determining how the tropical season is going to evolve. And I think that was something of great interest to them. We also looked at, if you look at the frequency of landfall across the United States, there's 19 states from Mexico to Maine that have coastal areas that could be suspect to a tropical cyclone landfall. That's a huge area to keep track of. So these emergency managers are, I'm sure, constantly on the lookout. So I would provide for them what the frequency is. Landfall in southern Florida, of course, is much greater than southeast Georgia. Florida sticks out like a sore thumb, just like the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
How about those hurricane return periods? I know we always hear about, it's been 30 years since a hurricane made landfall here, and it's supposed to happen every, say, 10 or so years. Any insight on that and what those are made out of?
Well, there's about a 110-year record that's used to produce that kind of ranking, and there's some validity to that. If you look back to Hurricane Irene's landfall in New York, and you look at the frequency of landfalls in that portion of the U.S., it's about once every 20 to 22 years. Well, the previous landfall, remember Irene was 2011, the previous landfall was Bob up in the New England, and that was 1991. So that frequency actually worked out quite well. But as we know with flooding, a 100-year flood can occur in successive years. It doesn't mean you have to go 100 years between floods.
Very true. As the folks in Oklahoma just learned recently with some of their 1,000-year floods and probably 100-year flood records being surpassed.
Oh, yeah, I haven't seen the numbers on that, but that is truly unprecedented out there. I was there in Norman last week for a workshop, and in 18 hours, one day last week, we received in Norman the average monthly rainfall for May, and it occurred in 18 hours. And I haven't seen what the latest total is for Norman, but it's got to be above 23 inches now.
I think I tweeted out a picture last night. I think it's around in 24, 25 inches now in the Norman area. And John, kind of talking about, I forgot to mention what all you've done here in the weather world when I introduced you. I mean, you worked with, right now you're working at WGAEL there in Lancaster, but you also was with the Weather Channel, and you were one of the first storm analysts, if not the first, I believe, is what I've read up on the Weather Channel. So talking about that, how did you go about that when hurricane season come around? Were you able to do the break-ins like many of the others that we've seen now with those hurricanes? Talk to us a little bit about how you approached hurricanes with your job there at the Weather Channel.
Oh, sure. That was an interesting job. I started there August of 1998. I'm surprised how long ago that was. It seems like it wasn't that long ago, but you were talking about 16 years. It's astounding.
Our weekend meteorologist.
Right. But I do remember vividly my first day. It was Hurricane Bonnie making landfall on the Outer Banks. Actually, it was on the coastal portion of North Carolina, and Jim Cantori was doing a live report. And I don't remember, maybe it was Bonsale, maybe that's where it was, in North Carolina. But what I remember distinctly about that, I was actually hired to be their training coordinator. So what I was hired to do was to work as a liaison between the on-camera people and the forecasters. And it was very much like a SOO position in the National Weather Service. And that's why I wanted it. It was a great opportunity to influence the national forecast. So when I started there in August of '98, John Hope was manning the reins for tropics, and they had hired Steve Lyons, I think, within the last 6 or 8 months. So you had Steve Lyons and John Hope handling the tropics, and I was providing the research perspective that could aid the forecast. So initially, I didn't have much to do with the tropical side at all, but I do remember my first day. It was that landfall, and I said to John Hope, "Well, what can I do to help you with this? You know, I'm so excited to be here. What can I do?" And he pointed to me. He said, "You stand right there. You don't say a thing, and you watch." Well, I did, and I learned from him, and I miss him terribly. He was a great colleague of mine. But as that opportunity progressed, they started this morning program called Your Weather Today. And they asked me if I would like to be one of the 4 people that was a regular on that program from 7 to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. And I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity. Yeah, of course. So I took that job, and we talked about what my role would be. Well, probably looking at threatening weather or the prospects for threatening weather across the entire United States. Well, I came up with the term of storm analyst. I proposed that to my boss, and he said, "Yeah, that's it. You're the storm analyst." So I actually was the first one there. And as part of that role, I covered the May 3rd, '99 outbreak in the Great Plains. And that was truly a career event for me.
Yeah, that's we did a lot of stuff last month on the Oklahoma tornadoes, and Gary England was on, and Gary said that was that was the one of the 2 events that really just got to him. So massive casualties and chaos out there during the May 3rd tornado and more.
Oh, I remember it vividly, and it was the first time the National Weather Service used the term tornado emergency. Now, we've talked a little bit about that. Are we using it too much? Is it being used inappropriately? And now we've got people in the private sector not affiliated with the National Weather Service using that terminology as well. So we may be hurting ourselves in the long run. But I'm getting off topic here.
No, that's perfectly fine. And I believe from my research, you were at Millersville University, and you worked with the disaster research part there. Talk to us maybe a little bit about that as we kind of transition into this hurricane season. I've been doing some research, and it's been almost 10 years now that a major landfall and hurricane has hit the Atlantic Basin, the East Coast or the Gulf, with the last one being Hurricane Wilma. What are your concerns about the folks that live across the coastlines in the Gulf and the Atlantic, with it being such a long period of time between major hurricanes hitting? I mean, with your research you've done with that, is there a way that we can make sure the folks are still aware and alert with the possibilities of just one storm hitting, or do you think people's let their guard down? I mean, talk a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. As part of the disaster research program at Millersville, I started on there just when that program was beginning to rev up. And so it was in its infancy. And one of the things we did when that program was started, we went down to New Orleans and then to Biloxi about 6 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. I will never forget what that looked like. You saw, the devastation on television, but it didn't give you any perspective on the scope. And when you went down there and you saw it through your own eyes and through your own perspectives, it was absolutely mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. And we went down there to talk to first responders, to talk about the communication process that led up to and then in the aftermath of the hurricane. And you've probably seen pictures of parking lots full of school buses that were completely submerged. I mean, here was a transportation system in place to evacuate, and they're all underwater. and that there were some major errors made in pre-positioning, in communication, and then in the aftermath, it was as if we were in a third world country, and not in the United States. So I think what we've learned initially is, then that, in fact, I should also mention that was a very good forecast. 72 hours in advance, it was still, the Hurricane Center was still putting the majority of their landfall forecast in the vicinity of southern Louisiana. So nobody should have been caught off guard, but yet they were. So I think what we've found is communication is key. You've got to have the communication lines pre-positioned ahead of time and know where your resources are going to be. Plan. In fact, when I forecast, I always say, expect this, but plan for this. So you expect a high probability event, but you also plan for the outlier, because you don't want to be surprised. Now, as we move ahead, when you asked the question, Scotty, one of the events that came to mind was Hurricane Charlie. Remember that hit Florida? Was that 2005? 4?
I believe so. Yeah, 2004
Yeah.
maybe.
It was 4.
Yeah, it was 2004 because that kind of started the whole string for Florida that year with Charlie and Francis and all of that.
That's right. In fact, if you look at the tracks from 2004, Polk County in central Florida was hit by 3 hurricanes. They crisscrossed right over Polk County.
Wow.
But what worries me is the age population in Florida. You have an enormous number, high percentage of senior citizens that have neither evacuated, would not know how to evacuate, or truly have no experience with severe weather. They've just migrated to Florida to spend the rest of their years. Well, Hurricane Charlie made landfall in Punta Gorda, and the average age the average age was 65 or older in that location. And Charlie went from a Category 1 to a Category 4 overnight, right? And then it made landfall. It made this right-hand turn. And it was the worst-case scenario for people who were living down there, had no idea how to evacuate. So I think, in answer to your question, which is somewhat long at this point, I really think that the population growth down there, both where they're living now and also their age, I think is a great concern for forecasters.
Well, let's kind of transition that up to your area where you guys live up there in the New England states. I know Sandy was a major, not a major hurricane, but a major event for your area. But up there, I mean, the Nantucket Island, the Cape there, you guys are susceptible to, or they are susceptible to seeing hurricanes that way too. Do you think they're as prepared as they should be?
There's tremendous growth on the coast. You go to Long Island or coastal New Jersey, even from Manhattan, and then head out coastal Long Island, Rhode Island, up into Massachusetts, the Cape you were saying, and even down east Maine. You don't expect a major hurricane landfall there, yet there's all this growth taking place, and there's a tremendous amount of investment. There's a tremendous amount of wealth now in place along the coastlines. So it doesn't take a major hurricane to create a billion-dollar disaster, as we have seen. Irene was a $7 or $11 billion disaster, but Sandy, the latest numbers on Sandy boggle the mind. It's not the insured loss, but the total damages is what, $65 billion? You could run a country the size of Lebanon on $65 billion. So I think that's a great concern. Also, with the rising sea levels, even abnormally high tides can cause some flooding. It's called nuisance flooding. You can have a high tide that creates nuisance flooding. Now you bring a coastal storm up towards these regions that have this huge population, tightly packed, high density, and a lot of wealth, and you're setting yourself up for another economic disaster.
We're facing that similar situation in Hampton Roads, John, and I remember Dr. Bill, who was it? Bill Reed, the former director of the National Hurricane
Bill Reed, yeah.
Yeah, he had mentioned at NWA in Charleston in 2013 some of his zones that he thought were most at risk, and one of them was the Norfolk, Virginia region, or Hampton Roads, just because, as you mentioned, we're seeing a lot more of that nuisance flooding. With Norfolk being so low as it is on the coastline already, it actually was built kind of on the water, they put more soil down and built it to where it used to be water in the harbor, and now it's land. The water's coming back, and people are kind of shocked it's flooding in those areas. But that's going to be a huge factor that we're going to face in the next 20 years, 40 years, however many years, then when the next 1933 hurricane comes up the Chesapeake Bay again and wipes out the majority of that area that's been really built up in the military standpoint. So not just from an economic standpoint, but from a United States readiness standpoint too.
Do you remember Hurricane Isabel in 2003? One of the forecasts was right at the Chesapeake Bay.
Yep, I remember that. I was in 5th grade at the time. I live in Hampton, Virginia, for my hometown, and so I was sitting there on my teacher's computer in 5th grade looking at the Hurricane Center forecast and noting that the gigantic storm track was right over us as a major hurricane. So one of the more terrifying moments of my early childhood. So.
Yeah, you make me feel very old.
Well, that's all right, because our weekend meteorologist, or now weekday meteorologist, he's been training me, and he's been going. And back in the day, I remember we used to do it this way, and I'm like, David, you're only like 40 or something. Calm down, buddy.
Right.
But anyway, back on topic.
Yeah, so, sure.
Talk a little bit about ACE and what ACE is, and even though we had maybe a really below average hurricane season, how we can have a really maybe above average ACE.
Sure. Well, let's see if I can screen share this with you.
I think Joey can share it too.
Let's see. There we go.
There you go.
Can you see that?
Yep, gotcha.
All right. So this, I just tracked this down from NOAA before we started the program, and this is a really fascinating topic that you mentioned. What we're doing is we're looking at, we're summing up the square of 6-hour maximum winds for tropical cyclones that are at least sustained 35 knots or greater. And when we sum those up for a season and look at the climatology of that, we can see that there has, and the yellow here represents near average conditions, that there was a quiescent period in terms of accumulated cyclone energy index from 71 to about 95. And then since 95, there's been this tremendous change in terms of the numbers associated with ACE, or accumulated cyclone energy index. And what's happened recently is equally fascinating. Look at 2013, 2014, and then the outlook just issued by NOAA today, and it is basically calling for a 70% chance of an ACE that's at or below average. So this trend that we've seen for the last couple of years of below average cyclone energy index is something to watch carefully. And as I mentioned, you only need one storm. So if you go back here and look at 92, and it was near average, right? It's in the yellow region, but it's below 100%. So it was near about 70 to 80% when we had one major hurricane that resulted in a $35 billion disaster to Florida. And keep in mind, it didn't strike Miami. The hurricane went across Homestead and then into the west coast of Florida. It missed Miami. I mean, these figures could have been astronomical if it had hit Florida, closer to Miami. So back to ACE, you can see that this is a multi-decadal frequency of essentially support for tropical cyclone frequency. And the red bar suggests, and this is what NOAA's going with, and every outlook that I've seen so far is talked about at or below average. And that kind of makes sense given the strong influence that ENSO plays in the outlook. Now, also we're looking at, I think, below average sea surface temperatures in the majority of the tropical Atlantic. I'm going to get rid of the screen share so we can talk again. There we go. So I think what's fascinating is the role that ENSO is going to play, and in addition to that, what will the tropical atmosphere look like? Will it contain too much dry air, as we saw last season? Will there be too much shear, which we also saw last season? And will it be dominated by sinking motion over the majority of the tropical Atlantic, which would feature perhaps upward motion over the Gulf of Mexico and closer to the U.S.? And I think that's something we have to watch. If we do not get, say, for example, Cape Verde hurricanes that travel across the basin and make its way towards the southeast or into the Gulf of Mexico. If that's not the case this season, then we're going to have to pay close attention to rapid tropical cyclone development, perhaps in the Gulf Coast or in the Bahamas or in the Caribbean, where right now the sea surface temperatures are above average.
And kind of thinking back to the past 2 years, that's kind of what we've had. We've had a lot more storms developing closer to the coast. We had, two subtropical storms, I think, in 2012 or 2013 that made landfall near the Florida coastline. Then we had 1 or 2 storms last year that kind of formed near the coast. So it's interesting, the variability season to season in where the storms form.
Oh, I think that's an excellent point, and one that we have to watch carefully. And what's interesting is the folks in Bermuda have been taking it on the chin. They took 2 hurricane landfalls last year.
Yeah, it's like throwing darts at a dartboard. How many times are you going to hit the bullseye?
Yeah, precisely. Right. So the positioning and the strength of the subtropical anticyclone over the deep tropics will play a major role in where these cyclones, once they develop, where they move.
Speaking of that, John, maybe if you want, for the next couple of seconds, we can talk about the difference between a El Nino and a La Nina season for hurricanes here in the Atlantic Basin and the Gulf compared to what's going on in the Pacific. Maybe you want to talk with our viewers why we see an influx during La Nina and kind of a downward period during El Nino season. What exactly goes into that, and why do we see that?
Sure. When we talk about the ENSO phase, we're really talking about the sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific relative to long-term climatology. And during periods where we have anomalously warm waters in the Pacific, that tends to relate to a loss of the trade winds. So when you lose the trades, you get a buildup of warm water at the surface. And in fact, the satellites that we have in space right now are so precise that they can actually measure the height of the water surface and determine that the heights are actually rising. Well, if there's a greater heat content, a deep heat content in the tropical waters, then the level will rise. And that can actually be measured by satellite. So we've got rising motion then over the Pacific. That air is going to sink somewhere, and it tends to sink over the deep Atlantic tropics. And so when we have ENSO, a strong ENSO in place, in fact, I was just looking at the latest guidance with respect to ENSO, and it does look like we're looking at perhaps a weak to moderate positive phase of ENSO that could last actually into next winter. And that's another question that we could pick up another time, is what does that mean for next winter? But talking about the tropics, we do see some rising motion in the Gulf of Mexico and perhaps even through the Caribbean associated with an ENSO, but more typically sinking motion over the deep tropics of the Atlantic, which could inhibit, for example, a Cape Verde storm.
And John, we're talking about that. We've seen the focus. Let's kind of focus back to hurricanes. When we see those forecasts come out, the 5-day and the cone of uncertainty and stuff like that, and then they pop up the coordinates and the pressure and the winds. Talk a little bit about today. We had the director of the Hurricane Center actually speaking in Greenville, North Carolina, and he was talking about, I was following the tweets from Nate Johnson, and he was wanting to make a big emphasis on a lot of people focus their attention on those wind speeds, but it's really the storm surge that causes the most damage there along the coastline.
Oh, that's very true. And in addition to that, Scotty, the focus often is the centroid of that cone of uncertainty. And people think, well, if I just follow the line, and that line doesn't go over where I live, then I'm safe. Well, that line is just the midpoint. Rarely does the tropical cyclone follow the centroid, right? There's this area of uncertainty. And I can recall, was last year or the year before, that one of the tropical cyclones followed the left margin of the cone of uncertainty. So that is there just to give us a sense of the uncertainty and a sense of the probability of what the future movement might be. We've made tremendous strides in forecasting. The Hurricane Center has tremendous strides in forecasting the track of tropical cyclones. Not so much in forecasting the intensity. And as we were just talking about Charlie, that was one of those storms that was a big surprise. Another one I can think of is Hurricane Opal. I think that was at 94. That was another one of these hurricanes that went from a Category 1 to a Category 4 during a reconnaissance mission. So, you know, if it moves over warm waters that have a high heat content and there's no shear in place, then these can bottom out relatively quickly. So to go back to your original question, we're paying attention. Actually, what was it, Scotty? I've lost track now.
No, it's okay. We're talking about the focus. A lot of people, like you're saying, focus on the center of the cold, right. But also the focus on the wind being against the storm surge.
Well, at one time there was just a 72-hour forecast, and anything beyond 72 hours wasn't available to the public. And the reason why it wasn't available was because there was a concern it could be misused. And it's just like today. The GFS is available out 200 plus hours. So I've always felt you can find any storm you want looking out beyond 200 hours. And it ends up on the internet, and then you have a forecast that everyone's talking about. So
there actually is one.
Right. That's true. That's true. There is one. Well, just because you can make that forecast, is that something that we should make available publicly?
Exactly.
That's an interesting debate. But that uncertainty has to increase as you go further out in time. And you know, we're looking at a 5-day forecast. Eventually, we'll look at a 7-day forecast track.
I know Daniel's got one, but one popped in my head, Daniel, and then we'll get to yours because I know what you're going to ask about. Something that the National Weather Service and the Hurricane Center started to do is issue those storm surge forecasts. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because that's a fairly new product that's being talked about in the weather world. Kind of break that down and talk about the impacts with those who live along the coast.
Oh, I think that's a great improvement that the Hurricane Center is providing. As you mentioned earlier, most fatalities occurred due to the storm surge, not due to the winds, not due to the tornadoes that develop when tropical cyclones make landfall. It's this rapid rise in water that catches people off guard. Now, there is some freshwater flooding that occurs, and in some of the insurance cases that I've been involved in, where claims have been made, the policyholder will have coverage for freshwater flooding but not saltwater flooding, which I've never understood if you live near the coast. Why would you do that? But nonetheless, it is that rapid rise in water that occurs as the tropical cyclone center moves towards the coast. So that surge, I think what the public needs to know is how much water are we talking? They're not really cognizant of what their elevation is, how much above the datum they're located. What they really need to know is the forecast inundation height. So if my steps are at 20 feet, front of my house is at 20 feet, and the storm surge is at this level, should I be concerned? And so that's what the inundation numbers are giving us now. The storm surge is giving us the actual depth of water. Very simple. That's what we need to know. And as that water moves inland, then greater numbers of communities will be affected by the inundation. And I think that's a great improvement.
Daniel, your question?
Yeah, John, we've been talking about hurricanes and their impact along the coast so far. Let's kind of shift our focus inland a little bit and talk about, you know, hurricanes and tropical systems are a big deal, even away from the coast. Talk about that. And I know a lot of people, they seem to think, well, the wind's not an issue, but talk about how much, you know, the rain is as much a problem as the wind.
Oh, yeah. Those two together provide or can result in tremendous loss of life. Daniel, with your question, I was thinking about Hurricane Hugo back in I think it was 89, right?
Yeah.
There was high pressure to the north and low pressure to the south, so it actually funneled the cyclone into Charleston, South Carolina, and it was making landfall at an unheard of speed of about 22 knots, which meant that the tropical cyclone maintained hurricane characteristics in terms of its wind field when it moved over Charlotte. And there were people in Charlotte without power for 2 weeks, if I remember correctly, because of all the trees that were down. Now, a fast-moving storm system like that, fast-moving tropical cyclone, will not produce as much rainfall because it's moving so quickly. But when these large systems slow down, then all that moisture is going to have to be lost, and it's lost in flooding rain. So Ivan, after it made landfall, was a $300 million disaster for the state of Pennsylvania. It made landfall on the Gulf Coast, but it's a $300 million disaster in Pennsylvania due to flooding.
You know, and I'm glad you mentioned that, John, and kind of thinking back to 2004, I think with Ivan and even Francis, that was one story that nationally got completely lost because in a matter of 2 weeks, we had two tropical systems dump a lot of rain here in the southern Appalachian region. Matter of fact, with Francis, the Asheville, North Carolina area had its third worst flooding ever, and there were parts of Asheville that was completely flooded out. But everybody's attention was with what was going on in Florida at the time that completely got ignored. And like you said, that's a big deal. And even like you said, it doesn't take a huge, strong storm with a whole bunch of wind. I gave an example talking about in the mid-'90s you had Tropical Storm Jerry in 1994. It formed off the east coast of Florida. It really never got organized into anything other than maybe a minimal tropical storm. It moved inland and it dumped a foot of rain on Greenville, South Carolina because it just crawled inland.
Yeah, right. There have been some monsters in that regard that have dumped tremendous amounts of rain. When I was a graduate student, I was doing some research after the fact, of Hurricane Camille. That was 1969, and that struck past Christian in Mississippi. Now, when we were down there after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we talked to some people and said, "Why did you hang here? Why didn't you evacuate?" And the comments that we saw several times were, "We made it through Hurricane Camille. How could anything be worse than Camille?" Well, the storm surge from Katrina was 25, 26 feet, right? Well, Camille, when it made landfall, moved up through the deep south and then moved over the central Appalachians and stalled. And one of the concerns I have when I forecast is, are there any slow-moving boundaries that a tropical cyclone can get hooked up to? I even did that. And that can result in tremendous flooding. So Camille actually dropped 28 inches of rain in central Virginia in 24 hours. 140 fatalities. Some people never found again. So your point is well taken. These systems can dump flooding rains and loss of life.
I believe Joey has a viewer question.
I do. First off, Dr. John, Tropical Storm Jerry. I was outside for a Red Akins concert, outside for that. And then, of course, you mentioned Hurricane Hugo. Every weather nerd has their storm. That was my storm. That was the storm that got me into it. But our viewer question comes from Lynn, faithful follower, watches us all the time. She asked, "We've already had Anna this year. Is that an indication that our tropical season will be more active than normal?" And I'll expand on that. Does any season early activity, does that usually lead to an active season or not?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I think a lot of people would ask, at least are thinking about. Could an early season tropical cyclone portend a busy season? Not necessarily, and the reason for that is how that early system formed. This was a rather unique case. Anna actually has its origins, or had its origins, in a slow-moving upper-level trough that moved slowly across the Gulf of Mexico, right? And then it moved over Florida, where the warmest sea surface temperatures are this time of year, and it got caught under a big ridge. And as it did so, it lost track of the connection to the polar westerlies. So whatever shear was in place went away. And what we have found is the transition from a baroclinic system to a tropical system, you got to get rid of the shear to protect the core, and that needs to be over warm water. And that's exactly what happened. So Anna was a transition from baroclinic to tropical. That's not an indication of what the tropical season will be like.
Alrighty, sounds good. Um, sorry, I was sidetracked and doing something else there for a moment. But anyway, talk a little bit about some of the changes that the Hurricane Center is adapting for this year. I know we're seeing, I think, further outlooks in-house, and then we're also trying to put out different maps as well.
Yeah, in fact, you may be more on this than I am, more up to date on this than I am. But I think they're trying to push the envelope in terms of their forecasts, and I also know that they're narrowing the zone of uncertainty or the cone of uncertainty to try to provide perhaps a better, more accurate forecast. And that is due to the improvements that have been made both in the track forecast and in the intensity forecast. But as we talked earlier, I think the number one improvement is the storm surge and providing guidance to coastal residents in terms of how much inundation that they could expect.
It makes me wonder a little bit, Dr. Scala, though, when we keep shrinking the cone, but we have storms that are large, like, Katrina size, Sandy size, but the cone's only including maybe one state, because it's getting so good.
Mm-hmm.
Are we actually causing a greater communication issue to where people just think of the cone, be like, oh, the storm track's here, and the cone says we're outside of it. Do we have any impact?
Oh, I think that's a great question, and I would say that for the average viewer, or the average user of that technology, there's going to be misinterpretation. I don't see any way around that. Just like we talked earlier, if you focus on that black line in the middle of that cone of uncertainty, you're missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
That is the median. That is the centroid. That does not give you an indication of you can go far to the left or far to the right. Rarely ever does a tropical cyclone follow the center. Just think about how often you get an average temperature.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, right? Because it's the average of extremes. Same thing's going to happen, I think, here. So there has to be, whenever you produce a new product, you have to have at least a period of education, and you have to bring the users along with you so that they understand how to correctly interpret the product.
I'm fascinated by your insurance connection to hurricanes, and if you can't answer this is fine, but how much do insurance companies change after a hurricane? Because I've known that, in some of our areas, after a storm, the premiums may go up, or they may change their policies based off of the impact of that storm. Is that something that's actually pretty well known or happens a lot?
Oh, I think it does. Hurricane Katrina, one of the biggest issues down there was wind versus water. Mm-hmm. So how does a homeowner submit a claim when his home is completely gone and his claim is for wind damage and not water? Well, presumably there's going to be some wind ahead of the water. Now, could that wind have been strong enough to create a loss in his roof that would then allow fresh water to make an entrance and then result to damage to the interior contents? There were, I believe, 30,000 claims held up in court after Hurricane Katrina, and some insurance carriers just said, I'm out of here. I'm not dealing with this. I'm no longer insuring along the Gulf Coast, and some companies actually fold. So there is a huge economic incentive, I think, for insurance carriers to be very careful of their risk, and when they underwrite, who and where they're going to underwrite.
I mean, it's a business as much as we hope that sometimes it isn't, and they're always out, there for you after the storm. It is a business, and they have to stay afloat as well. No pun intended with the storm surge, but
they do, and the adjusters that I've talked to really do care for their clientele. And when they ask me to provide an assessment of wind damage or hail, or I've had several Sandy claims where the question was, well, how strong was the wind, and how long did it, or for what period of time did it precede the onset of the flooding waters from the storm surge? They want to help their clients, but at the same time, they're not going to cover a policy that was not in effect, for example.
USAA was very helpful to us after Hurricane Isabel, I'll say that, in getting everything replaced, including food in our freezer that we had just bought too. They actually covered that, and I was very surprised. But
I got to mention, that's one of my most distinct memories from Hurricane Katrina was when I was in New Orleans 6 weeks after. You saw pictures of the flooding in New Orleans. Well, there were so many homes without power and full refrigerators and freezers. What did everybody do with all that? They carted it out of their homes and stuck it on the curb. So you could walk through the streets of many of those wards east of New Orleans and just see this line of refrigerators and freezers full of food fermenting on the street. And one of the after effects of a tropical cyclone is you get all the subsidence, right, around the periphery of this huge circulation. So you can get some record temperatures. And the temperature soared to 100 degrees in New Orleans after Katrina. So you have all this food sitting on the streets fermenting. I won't forget the odor from that.
Nope. We ate pretty well after Hurricane Isabel because we had to get all the food out of our freezer, so it was steaks and burgers every night.
Good for you.
After
Hey, Ricky, did the insurance company cover your orange juice after the break-in too?
No, they didn't. That's a whole nother story. After a storm, though, Dr. Scala, what is the #1 claim? Is it wind or is it water? Are there more wind cases or water? And I guess it would be kind of storm dependent, too.
Yeah, it does, and it's location dependent. I saw a number of cases where the homeowner was asking for the carrier to take care of wind damage, and you look at the home, and the shingles are in place, and the dormers are in place, but they're missing the first floor. So how is that a wind damage event? It's not. It's a storm surge event. But they were trying to recoup some money. I mean, as I said, it's a $65 billion loss. And maybe 35, 40 billion of that was covered. So you're still talking about $20 billion of loss that's not covered.
I was mentioning to our meteorologist earlier today about Oklahoma City and a lot of those areas when it comes to flood insurance, how few people probably had flood insurance in some of those areas. What's the situation with that kind of case? Is it you should have had flood insurance?
Oh yeah, they play roulette. Many people will play roulette with their homeowner's insurance. I don't. I recently added a rider to my home to cover the loss of my sump pump. Now I live on somewhat of an elevated area, but the backyard slopes down to my basement. And you know what caused me to think about this was a couple years ago, first it was Hurricane Irene, and then right after Hurricane Irene was Tropical Storm Lee. Well, that was a huge issue here. In fact, in some locations, the flooding actually superseded, what was it? Help me here. What's the flood record in Central Penn? Agnes. The flooding actually exceeded Agnes in 1976. So when I saw that happening, I said, no, I'm not. Even though I'm in a good place, I'm still going to put a rider on my home. But a lot of people, they just play roulette and they say it's not going to happen to me. I don't have to worry about extreme weather. It's not going to happen to me.
And Dr. Scala, talking a little bit about that as we close in on the 9 o'clock hour. I have two questions, one fun question, but this is my serious question, is for those who may have just moved to the coastline, or maybe those who are watching tonight are considering moving to the coastline, what would you suggest to them that they need to do insurance-wise? What do they need to have with their house to make sure that it's covered if they were to be hit by one of these hurricanes?
I would have my home inspected first. I would see how old is my home, how old is the roof, have there been any claims on that property prior, has it been impacted by flooding rain or high wind, what's the construction like. So I'd get an engineer to come in and really take a close look at the construction and see, is it built to code? I saw some buildings that went up after the 99 outbreak, May 3rd, 99 outbreak in Oklahoma, and they were supposed to be rebuilt to code, and they were not. People still try to take shortcuts, so I would definitely, I would investigate that. I would also take a look at who's insuring and what the cost of insurance would be. And then once you settle on your property, Scotty, the next thing I would think about is what's my evacuation route? Because sooner or later I'm going to have to evacuate. It's just, odds are going to get you eventually.
Right. Well, my last question for you, and I guess kind of fun question as we wrap up our interview, is through your career in weather, what has been the most memorable hurricane that you recall? Maybe you were in it, you were covering it, or you experienced it, or just something that you watched from afar. What is the most memorable hurricane that you've seen?
As a kid, we used to spend part of every summer in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. And I do recall, and I don't remember which one it was, but probably in the early 70s, I remember a hurricane making landfall around that area. And I just remember getting up the next day and going down to the water, and there was no beach. Absolutely no beach. It was completely wiped clean. That's one memory. I think the other, probably most profound impression I have is Hurricane Katrina, and seeing the kind of widespread cataclysmic damage that could cause. I will never forget that.
And I want to say, because New Orleans was the metro area, but the surrounding communities over in Biloxi, Mississippi, Gulf Shores, Alabama, those places were hit just as hard as New Orleans, but I guess for metro area wise, it wasn't really as covered as much as New Orleans was.
No, but when you get down outside, I was also in Gulfport, and we drove along the coastline down to Biloxi. And ironically, the first structures that were rebuilt were the casinos, because they provide so much economic support for not only the region but for the state. So there were contractors living in tents, literally on the beach, while they're rebuilding the casinos. And some of those casinos, of course, wound up inland. There were some floating casinos that floated, right inland. But today, I haven't been down there in years, but I understand that route, and I can't remember the name of the road, is it Route 90, along the coastline? They haven't rebuilt there. So unlike what we do in the east, we lose a home due to high water or flooding or a tropical system, we rebuild it. Look at Charleston. You'd never know that there was a Hugo down there. Well, that's not true now along the Gulf Coast between Gulfport and Biloxi.
One area on the East Coast that I can think of where they're not letting them do that anymore is right along the North Carolina Outer Banks. They've got a policy at a lot of those houses near Okeechobee that once they fall in, they're gone forever.
As it should be.
Yeah.
Too many places where the horse is out of the barn.
And I think as we wrap up, I think Kit has one last question about evacuation routes, and then we'll get you out of here on time, John.
Oh, I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, here at UNC Charlotte, just around campus at a lot of the stop signs, you'll see like green evac route, orange evac route, purple evac route, and it's basically a bunch of hurricane routes. And I was just wondering, is that probably in place because of Hugo?
It was probably there before Hugo, but I'm sure that it's been increased.
If I can comment on that, John.
Go right ahead.
Just because I've worked with the police department on campus and heard of that's part of their new plan. It's actually a little bit of their storm-ready plan that we're putting in place as part of the kind of just the whole campus safety initiative. They've had those plans in place for a while, but they've started mapping them out. And so it's not so much for hurricanes; it's more for campus evacuations and any type of like bomb on campus or sector of campus needs to be evacuated or something like. But it does present a really interesting question that I can play off of, and maybe color-coded evacuation routes. Meaning, if you live, we're going to take the Hampton Roads area, for example. You live in Norfolk and Portsmouth, you're going to evacuate via the purple signs on Route 460. Or if you live on the peninsula a little further north, you're going to evacuate via the orange signs on Interstate 64. Kind of another visual clue, if the traffic backup probably wasn't enough of a visual clue in the first place, but a sign that people could see as they drive along thinking, where do I have to go? Almost similar to maybe tsunami signs, or maybe even putting signs in communities that are at high risk from a Category 1, 2, or 3 storm surge.
Right. I was just thinking as you were mentioning that, one of the after effects of Sandy was a lack of gasoline. And my brother and my sister still live in New Jersey. They were without gas, it just seemed like for weeks. So they were driving into Pennsylvania to get gasoline. And I never understood, what's the problem? We should have pre-positioned resources to have that gasoline in place. because that ended up being a huge problem for the region.
Very much. I think Joey said he wanted to have the final question. So
Okay.
Joey, it's all yours, man.
All right, Dr. John. All of our guests, every time we have them on, we always like to ask them pretty much the same question.
Okay.
And this one will be especially for you because I have a third grader right now who's already made the decision that he is going for his doctorates of meteorology. That's his goal. Yeah. By the way, can I borrow some money?
Hey, Joey, I've got 4 kids. None of them want to do anything with weather.
He's already made that decision. But we do have some teachers who are listening. We have some students who are listening. We have students on our panel. Austin, who has been kind of quiet tonight, probably because he has exams. He's probably studying. But if you could give our students and/or our teachers one piece of advice for anybody who's wanting to, really go into this career and really take it all the way through, what would be the one thing you would tell them?
Well, the one thing? That's a great question. I would say think applied, because meteorology today is not a single discipline. It is incorporating everything from business to economics to government to even social science now. We're incorporating social scientists in our decision making. In fact, next week I'm part of an integrated weather impacts team that will be meeting at State College. We got about 40 of us, and we're going to be talking about how we can improve communication, and we've got social scientists as part of that. So anybody that's interested in meteorology right now, it's not just taking the weather classes. It's incorporating the other disciplines so that you can actually provide the kinds of input to society that we're going to need.
And just a follow-up to that, because, by the way, on our panel, we are totally in for the social sciences of weather. That's something that we've tried to focus on. We've done many shows about that, which, by the way, after you have this meeting, you'd like to come back on, maybe we'll talk about that again. But let's say a teacher who's got a student or a guidance counselor, for instance, who has a student who wants to go into meteorology. What would you tell them? What can they do to help that student to make sure they're incorporating all those fields?
Wow. I would say reach out, network. Be able to, because I'm sure teachers they have to cover so many subjects, they can't go too far into depth of each one. So they've got to rely on their resources to tap into. And you know what? Grab hold of a professional meteorologist now. I give so many talks, Joey. This time of year I give at least 2 a week. And it's from 2nd grade to 8th grade. And it also includes first responders, emergency managers. It includes insurance providers. I was the after-dinner speaker 2 weeks ago for Central PA's insurance group. So reach out to those professionals. They've got the knowledge and the experience that you can tap into, and if they're like me, we're more than willing to help out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Me and Scotty do a lot of school talks around this time of year ourselves. But yeah, that's great. By the way, Austin, if you're ever there studying and listening, make sure you keep Dr. Scala's email in your contact list there. Same for you, Kit. I know you're into college, but keep that in mind. I would tell my 8th grader to keep you on the list, but he's already fell in love with Dr. Shepard.
Oh yeah.
he picked him. I don't know why. But
Marshall and I go back a long way. We actually worked together at NASA back in the early '90s.
Wow. Yeah. We had Dr. Shepard on the show, and I guess that was when it happened for him. All right. That was my final question. I wanted to ask that. We like to throw that out there and keep that advice going. So
sure.
Thank you again for being on the show with us.
Oh, Joey, it was my pleasure, and I tell you what, ask me back. I'd love to do this again.
Yes. We book our shows out. We try to keep them as far in advance as we can. But I mean, if you ever got anything going on and you just have an idea and you want to do a show on it, just hit us up. Say, hey, I want to come on and talk about whatever, and we'll set that up for you.
Why don't we do that? In fact, if we get a major weather event of some kind, why don't we'll get on there and do it?
All right.
Yeah.
Scotty handles most of the booking, so we'll get it worked out.
Okay.
We'll definitely do it. Dr. Scala, I know you got to leave. If you have any social media or email you want to pass along maybe to some of our viewers, if they want to get in contact with you, feel free to. That's up to you.
Sure. My email address is scalawx@comcast.net, and you can find me on Facebook. I don't use Twitter as much as I should, so I'll try to bring that up to speed. But you can go to Weatherbrains, by the way.
Hold on now. You work with James Spann.
Well,
you are not on Twitter as much. Come on now.
Well, look at Nate Johnson.
That's
Nate
true, Nate as well.
Nate's like this the whole time. I can't keep up. You know who else is like that is Rick Smith.
Well, I was getting ready to say that, and while we were talking, I've been talking with Rick on Twitter, and he is supposed to come on our show back in April, and tornadoes got in the way, so we actually confirmed a date for him to come on. So he actually told me to tell you hello. So
he's one of my heroes.
He is honestly, an awesome
Rick
guy.
Smith, I admire him tremendously. So when you get him on, you're going to get the cream of the crop.
It is. Joey and I met Rick back in February at the Tornado Summit, and he's just an all-around awesome guy. I tell him that every time I talk to him. I was like, man, I don't envy your job because it's so crazy out there, but you do a great job at it.
Oh, I agree 100%. He is a good
guy. John, we need you to poke Bill Murray for us, because I think he's the only weather brains we haven't had booked on the show yet.
Okay.
So you have to poke him for us. Tell him, hey, we need to we'll do a whole weather history show. I know he loves it. So.
In fact, we're going to start doing that on Weather Brains. We're going to have a segment just on weather history because I post weather history stuff on my Facebook page just about every day.
Yeah, I was a history buff when I was a kid, and I was a weather nerd, so I combine the two later on too. You can ask me about almost any tornado in North Carolina, I'll tell you all about it.
Well, we'll have a show about that then.
We can do it.
Well, John, we appreciate it. We'll let you get off, and like I said, we'll keep in contact, and we'd love to have you back on anytime that's good for you.
I'd love to do it. Thanks a lot, Scotty.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a great evening.
You too. So long.
See ya. All right, guys. Well, hurricane season officially starts next week, and I don't know if we covered the exact numbers, but I do have them written down. Dr. I forgot his name now. Out at Colorado State, what is it? Dr. Williams or something like that?
William Gray.
William Gray, yeah, that's it. Dr. William Gray. They have predicted 7 named storms, 3 of those being hurricanes and 1 major hurricane. And I know that Ricky mentioned earlier the NOAA came out with their prediction today: 6 to 11 named storms, 3 to 6 hurricanes, and up to 2 major hurricanes. So we'll have to see how it pans out. Anybody?
It may pan out, but as we've mentioned tonight, I don't put much trust in it. And as we've been discussing today in some broadcast groups, the only people who probably really care are the public, which is kind of a bad thing in my opinion, because I guess it gets them talking about it, but everyone's going to lock onto that low number. So,
or the high number.
Well, yeah, or the high number, which isn't that high, and it could be higher. So.
And as we've heard, I've seen Brad Panovich post on Twitter today and Nate Johnson, it only takes 1 storm, and Dr. John Scala said that as well. It only takes 1 to cause chaos. Ask Miami in 1992.
There you go.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to exit off. I'm going to let Kit's going to be going away for a couple of weeks. Let me do mention this. Next week, we continue the hurricane theme with Jim Eds. Hurricane chaser. He's going to be coming in and talking a little bit about his adventures in numerous hurricanes. So we're looking forward to that. And
Jim's been talking a lot, not a little. Jim's got a lot.
Yeah, that's true. We may be on here for a while. So Jim's going to be on, and then we have sports weather with Brian. Niendorf.
Rudolph.
Yeah.
Rudolph.
And we're going to have Stuart Williams on with the PGA Tour. With that, and then we have the Myrtle Beach tornado show coming up in July the 7th or 8th, and just like I said, Rick Smith is going to be coming on July the 29th. So those are some of the upcoming shows that we're looking forward to. So Kit, I'm going to hand it off to you before we sign off.
Thank you, Scotty. Like you said, I'm going to be gone for the next few weeks, the next 6 weeks actually. I'm an orientation counselor here at UNC Charlotte now. And we have freshman sessions Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Thursday. So Wednesday nights are taken for the next 6 weeks for me. I'm going to miss doing this, but I should be back mid-July, and I'll be watching all the shows you do on the weekends.
But he gets paid to do his other thing, so.
Well, yeah, that's nice too. But I enjoy doing this as well.
Wait. What do you get paid to do the other things? You didn't get your check from us?
Joey, I told you to send it.
Oh man.
I don't think
know that I'm supposed to get one.
I don't think you put a stamp on the envelope.
You were,
Oh.
no, you weren't supposed to
Maybe.
send a check. You were supposed to wire it to my offshore account.
Oh, well, check with them.
Easy now. The government
Okay.
will be listening.
About that tax return, Joey.
All right, guys. Well, hopefully,
Oh, sorry.
hopefully, if you're watching us, you'll be able to get some rain here in the next few days. I know it's parched here in the Carolinas and Tennessee and Virginia and everywhere else. So, good luck with that. And anybody else has anything to add before we sign off?
That's it. Take it home.
Daniel, good having you on. We're looking forward. I think your sports season's about to come to an end, so hopefully we'll be having you on a little bit more often throughout the summer.
Yeah, the 9 months of everlasting madness, which is covering high school athletics here in McDowell County, is coming to an end, and now we're getting into the summer. I'll probably be back on a lot more. So looking forward to that and all the stuff that we talk about on here on a weekly basis.
Hey, Daniel, this is a great platform. People can go out and tweet and Facebook. So why don't you enlighten the guests or enlighten our followers and viewers who you're trying to get on? Maybe if they make a push on social media, we can get some confirmed information.
Well, for our folks here in the Western Carolinas and the Asheville and Greenville-Spartanburg area, we are working really hard to get WYFF Chief Meteorologist John Sesrich on our show. Been in contact with John a little bit, and we're looking at some dates, maybe in the month of July or August. And I know John's a big name in our market here in the Western Carolina. He's been here for a long time, and a lot of people love and respect what he does. So give John a little push on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and tell him that we want to see him on Carolina Weather Group.
That's right. John's a good guy. And we're also trying to get the weather freak and the weather geek on, Nick Kozer and Rob Eichler from Fox 46. We've been in talks with them as well. So we're trying to finalize our summer schedule. It's just not there yet. So like we always say, give us some ideas, give us some guests if you want us to have them on, and we'll work on it. And if you're up in Tennessee and Virginia, we can come see Ricky. Where at on Saturday?
We're going to be out at the Home Depot, or I'm going to be out at the Home Depot. They're doing an emergency weather preparedness workshop, so some of the other folks are going to be out there, and I'll be out there from 10 to 2. So
come see Ricky and get an autograph. Get your picture taken. Put it on Twitter or Facebook. Tag us in it.
Because one day he will be famous.
All right, guys. Everyone have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.